I think the government of Turkey and from President Erdogan himself, these have been consistently the same over the last 13 years. Even the way the relationships developed with the Esad regime, because Turkey was one of the first countries to take a strong stance and made strong statements against what Esad was doing.
Despite the regime fall, PKK-YPG activities continue in Syria. How will counterterrorism efforts will continue in the new era?
And when I say we need to live peacefully with everybody, of course, that, that doesn't include Israel. Not that we don't want peace with them, but at the end of the day, this is an occupation force. And of course, some of the very main and basic principles are democracy, plurality, meaning that there should be more than one political party, consideration, giving equal rights to all citizens, regardless of their backgrounds, especially based on religion or ethnic identity or sect within their religion. So these are some of the main things.
Suriye'de Bas Partisi'nin 61 yıllık iktidarı sona erdi. Esad rejiminin düşüşünün sonuçları hem küresel hem de bölgesel çapta büyük merak konusu. Muhalif güçlerin yalnızca 13 gün süren operasyonlarının sonuçları Suriye'yi nasıl etkileyecek? Türkiye'yi bu süreçte neler bekliyor? Tüm bu konuları konuşmak üzere bugün değerli bir konuğumuz var. Suriye Devrimci ve Muhalif Güçler Ulusal Koalisyonu Başkan Yardımcısı Dima Musa bizlerle. Ms. Musa, welcome. The 61-year-old Assad regime has collapsed in Syria. The struggle that started in 2011 has ended with the victory of the Syrian people. The opposition forces in Syria has united and captured Damascus in just 13 days. How did this operation begin?
So this operation began on the 27th of November, and the military opposition forces started moving from Idlib towards Aleppo, which was still under the control of the regime. And this is, in some way, was surprising to a lot of people. Maybe the timing was surprising, but this was expected for a long time because the opposition held areas had been under a lot of pressure. These areas that included Idlib and western Aleppo countryside have been for years holding a lot of displaced people from other parts of Syria. And this area before 2011 had less than 2 million people. At this point, there were over 7 million people there. Of course, this area had witnessed a lot of shelling and bombardment in previous years until around 2019 and even more so after March of 2020, when de-escalation zones were drawn through an agreement in the Astana, within the Astana group. And mainly it was agreements between Russia and Turkey to ensure that the military operations stopped. Because Turkey was presented as a guarantor of the opposition factions and Russia of the regime armed forces. So operations, military operations had subsided to a large part. And it was expected that this would pave the way to political dialogue between the Syrian opposition and the Syrian regime, but the Syrian regime continuously refused to sit at the table. Meanwhile, the Syrian armed forces continued to violate the de-escalation zones. We didn't have large military operations, but they would every once in a while bomb different areas within the de-escalation zone that is under the control of the opposition. And because it's densely populated, there's massive humanitarian problems there. The suffering was continuing with the economic situation worsening, and also especially after the earthquake last year, the humanitarian situation there became worse. So we had been continuously warning and working with the Turkish side to try to pressure the Assad regime through the Russian guarantors to stop these military offensives every once in a while because they were targeting civilian populations, and this was undermining the political process, and to actually engage with the political opposition. And we said, and of course the Turkish side, they were in agreement with us, and they saw this coming, that at some point all this pressure is going, if we don't have a political process, something is going to happen militarily. And a few months ago, it started to look like this was becoming more and more likely. Now, in the beginning, it was going to be, the talk was about just advancing to Aleppo. But as we saw since November 27th, that once they went into Aleppo and took Aleppo city, they continued marching until last Sunday when they entered Damascus.
Well, how did you bring these groups together, and how do you plan to keep them united?
So this is a really good question, because over the last few years, and even since the start of the opposition factions forming, in the beginning they were more united under the name of the Free Syrian Army. And then as the areas expanded, the areas that the opposition was gaining expanded, and the areas that were coming out of the control of Damascus and the control of the regime, the geographic division created these different factions. Now, their main goal remained the same. And I think that was an important factor in them uniting in this last offensive, in this last operation. But over the last few years, at some points, there were even clashes between them, because they had sometimes different ideologies, they were affiliated with different sides. For example, the main group in this operation, HTS, it is based in Idlib, and at some point previously had been an affiliate of Al-Qaeda, but then they actually dissociated from Al-Qaeda, and their rhetoric became more, we're Syrian, we want to topple the regime and achieve the goals of the revolution. The other factions that are actually affiliated with the Syrian National Coalition, they also have the same goals, toppling the regime, achieving the revolution goals, but they're politically, they were aligned with us. Of course, they're aligned with the political opposition or the Syrian National Coalition. However, when this operation started, I think everybody put aside their differences. So before, these differences caused them to sometimes clash with each other. They had areas of influence that are separate. There wasn't as much cooperation before. But once this operation started, I think everybody that is within these groups, because everybody is Syrian. So the young men in this group are Syrian, the young men in the other factions are Syrian, and all of a sudden they thought that we are liberating Syria. And I think that was a very strong factor in them working together. Another point is, a lot of the members of the factions, especially the ones that are affiliated with the Syrian National Coalition, they have been displaced from other parts of Syria that were under the control of the regime. So I think for a lot of them, their incentive was to go back to their hometowns.
What is the secret behind this success?
The secret behind this success is the need and the frustration from the Assad regime not engaging in a political process, not showing any indication that he wants what's good for Syria and the Syrian people, and them getting increasingly frustrated that even the international community wasn't doing anything to push forward the political process. And at some point, people want to take their rights with their own hands. And I think that's a very strong factor when it comes to these kinds of situations.
Will you take action on the international stage regarding Assad regime's crimes, including torture in prisons?
Of course, right now, the priority is to ensure that the state regains its strength, that people are provided with the basic services, that security and safety of the people is maintained and actually solidified, and that they get basic services, for example, things like education and health don't get interrupted, that the situation of the electricity and water and the daily needs, of course, going after the Assad regime and the main people, the main individuals and figures who were responsible for a lot of the crimes that were committed against the Syrian people. Of course, this is something that we will not put aside, we will not forget. But the important thing to remember here is that a lot of these crimes that fall under crimes against humanity and war crimes, they don't have a statute of limitations, meaning that at whatever point in the future, you can file a case, you can try these people for these crimes. For example, in law, some of the crimes, if you don't go after them within a certain amount of time, you lose your right to go after them. These crimes are not like that. And these crimes are certainly, and especially now that we're seeing what they had been doing, and which we knew, but now we're seeing it even more evident, what they had been doing in the detention centers, and we're seeing all the destructions they caused, not just to the infrastructure, but to the Syrian society. These are crimes that fall under crimes against humanity and war crimes. So at any point in the future, and I don't think it's going to be that long, I think the Syrian people, and this is a decision for the Syrian people. It's not a decision for the opposition. It's not a decision for any one political party. This is a decision for the Syrian people to decide when and how they will go after them. If they want to go after them in international tribunals, international courts, or if they want to do it through national courts, meaning through the Syrian judicial system.
Are you planning to draft a new constitution? And what fundamental principles will you prioritize?
Of course, drafting a new constitution has always been part of the political process that we had envisioned, and the political process that is actually outlined in Security Council Resolution 2254, which talks about, which lays out the roadmap for the political solution in Syria. And this is something that we have worked on. Of course, there was also at one point, a constitutional committee was formed, and I was a member of it. So we had done a lot of work as the opposition side to look at what the new Syrian constitution should like. And the main guide for us was what were the demands of the Syrian people when they started the revolution in 2011, and also what are the causes that made the people come out to the streets. What is it that the president and the government and the parliament were doing? What freedoms were the Syrian people deprived of that made them go out in this revolution to make sure that we take care of these issues in the new constitution? Of course, some of the very main and basic principles are democracy, plurality, meaning that there should be more than one political party, consideration, giving equal rights to all citizens, regardless of their backgrounds, especially based on religion or ethnic identity or sect within their religions. So these are some of the main things. And the overall, it should guarantee, the new constitution should guarantee for Syrian people basic freedoms and dignity and democracy.
The post-war economic situation in Syria looks challenging. How do you plan to restore Syria's economic situation?
Of course, this is one of the hardest issues that we're going to face, especially that Syria is still under a lot of sanctions, major sanctions from the US, but from other countries like the European Union, and these have not been lifted yet. The other thing is that the Syrian regime over the last 5 decades has been looting all of Syria's resources, and until now it's not clear what they have done, even with whatever was in in Syria, because they have, for over the years, they have been transferring a lot of the money that they were getting from the Syrian people, basically, into outside accounts. And we don't know what has been done yet. And of course, after 13 years of war, most of Syria is destroyed, and this was done by Syrian regime's shelling, and also because of the war, as well as the bad economic situation, I think, all over the world. So today we have to come together as Syrians and look at, of course, the best economic model that we want in the future Syria. We also need to figure out how we can benefit from Syrian capital, because there are a lot of Syrians who are now living outside of Syria. There have been in the diaspora, and a lot of Syrian businessmen, for example, living in Europe and the United States. They want to help rebuild Syria's economy. Of course, I think the return of some of the refugees, especially those living in neighboring countries, that will help the economic situation, because they might bring back with them some of their work, some of their expertise. We know a lot of businessmen or factories had moved their factories during the war years, so they might move them back. So it is going to be a lot of collaboration. It's going to be one of the hardest tasks. And of course, there is going to be some reliance on the international community. But we don't want to go back to the way things were, where Syria's economy is subservient to and independent on another country's interests or economy.
Despite the regime fall, PKK-YPG activities continue in Syria. How will counterterrorism efforts will continue in the new era?
Of course, that's one of our biggest problems right now. And counterterrorism, regardless of what side we're talking on, is something that we need to be very focused on, because a lot of countries that coming out of war, it's a fertile environment for different kinds of terrorist activities to take place, different groups trying to take advantage of the instability. With regard to the PKK-YPG activities in the Northeast, these are now in the Northeast, and they're starting to recede. Because over the last few days, we saw when the military operation started in November 27th, as the regime was withdrawing from different parts of Syria as the opposition groups were advancing. And I think that's also one of the reasons for success, that Russian and Iranian forces didn't support the regime as much this time as it had done previously. And the regime was just basically withdrawing from a lot of these areas. We also saw that the regime in the eastern part of the country was basically handing over these areas to SDF, which is affiliated with the PKK and YPG. So this was very concerning for us, mostly because, of course, because of this affiliation, because anybody fighting the regime can't be fighting them and having foreign elements within it, or being organically connected to a foreign group, especially one that is designated as a terrorist group. This was very concerning, of course. And mainly also because this looked like they might try to take over that area. And one of the main goals that we want to ensure something that we want to ensure doesn't happen is the division of Syria. This is not good for Syria, and it's not good for the countries around Syria. It's not good for the Syrian people. They don't want it. So as these areas were handed over, but we saw the military operation also start some activity in the eastern part. And a few days ago, they handed over, or they withdrew, the SDF forces withdrew from Deir ez-Zor. Now they remain in Raqqa and Al-Hasakeh. And the people there are also, they're seeing what's happening in the rest of Syria, and they want to be part of that too. I think now the responsible thing to do is for these forces that are calling themselves the Syrian Democratic Forces to really be Syrian. They need to dissociate themselves from the PKK and YPG. And we count on the Syrian people there, the Syrian people within these groups, to come to their senses. So there isn't a need for more battles, for more bloodshed. What we've seen yesterday, for example, there were some people celebrating the fall of the regime in the areas under the control of SDF, which is connected to PKK-YPG, and they opened fire on them. This is not acceptable. This is also not, in addition to being connected with a terrorist group, they are terrorizing the people themselves. So the idea is we want to make sure that there is no more Syrian bloodshed. The best thing to do is to do this peacefully. They dissociate with these groups. They send out and expel all foreign fighters, and then we can, and of course they need to become again part of Syria. Otherwise, there's a lot of work to do to counter terrorism, just like countering any other group. Going after those who are working on keeping these relations with the PKK, these connections continue. You need, of course, to also cut off the supply lines, whether in terms of weapons or elements. But this is, of course, a huge task to take on. So in this sense, we also need the support of the neighboring countries from which these groups are coming and advancing.
After the fall of regime, Israel has attacked several areas in Syria, northern Syria, and attacked military bases. What are your thoughts on Israel's claims over the Golan Heights, which remains under occupation?
Of course, we condemn this Israeli shelling and bombardment of an advancement and encroachment into more Syrian territory. As we know, the occupation of the Golan Heights is illegal under international law based on Security Council Resolution 242. So they are already violating international law, and they are an occupation force in the Golan Heights, even though they claim they're not. And this was a Security Council resolution that was adopted unanimously in 1967. So there is already that violation, and this advancement is trying to take advantage of the situation on the ground, of this change. You know, the regime was overthrown. Clearly, things are still not very organized. And what the indication that we also got from the way they were targeting, with, of course, over 400 airstrikes in one night, which is a very, it's unacceptable, and this needs to be condemned, not just by us Syrians, but by the international community, that it seems they had specific locations of weapons and military supplies. Our assessment is that the regime had given up these locations, and of course, you know, the Syrian people can go after the regime also because that falls under treason, giving away national security information. We consider this a violation of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and also this is, you know, they're attacking and property of the Syrian people. This belongs to the Syrian people. It doesn't belong to the regime. It is very concerning that we are seeing encroachment into parts of Syria, even beyond the UN zone and beyond, you know, into territories that are now considered Syria. They haven't been occupied before, and no international move against this. We have heard some statements, of course, but as usual, the countries that are able to stop this are not stopping it, and mainly I'm talking here about the United States, which it is a member of Security Council, so it had been, you know, it had voted for Security Council Resolution 242 that says the Golan Heights is occupied territory and should be returned to Syria.
What are your expectations from the international community?
Well, right now, of course, our expectations have been lowered over the last few years, but just because we felt that the international community didn't prioritize Syria at some point. And our demand was always, there is a lot of work. Of course, us Syrians have a lot of work to do, but the international community can also be a supportive or a pushing factor to ensure that we get what we want, or the Syrian people get what they want. This was before that we wanted the international community to shoulder its responsibility in order to ensure that a political process takes place. Today, this is still needed, even though the victory came as a military victory, but transition to a new Syria must be a political one. And it's still relevant in terms of the Security Council Resolution 2254, even though the regime is gone, but this is based on a dialogue among Syrians. And this is still, there is a roadmap for this political process with bringing together Syrians, and this still needs to be done under the auspices of the United Nations. This is where the international community needs to ensure that even though we saw the overthrow of the regime, that this new group that now has overtaken the rule, you know, until now there are some still positive statements, positive actions, but we need to make sure that this doesn't mean that we replaced one regime or one government with just another one, no matter what its affiliation or ideology is. We still need to have a government that represents all the Syrian people through a dialogue that all Syrians participate in. So the international community needs to ensure that, you know, because now they're starting to communicate with this new group, and they need to make sure that they say, okay, you overthrew the Assad regime, and now you need to work with all the other Syrian forces, political forces, to sit at the table and let them, you all as Syrians, decide the future of Syria. The other thing is that today the international community needs to see what the Syrian people need in terms of immediate support. For example, one of the things that some of my friends from Damascus have been telling me and other parts of Syria where the detainees are coming out, is that there are a lot of medical and, it's not just physical, but also psychological support that these people need, because they have been imprisoned, some of them for over a decade. There are some that have been imprisoned for decades, because there are some prisoners that have been in Esad prisons since the 1980s. And these people are dealing with a lot of psychological issues that we don't have the right expertise to deal with in Syria. So this is another way that some support can happen now. And of course, some immediate humanitarian support, because like we said, the economy is suffering. So there are some immediate needs that might not be able to be addressed quickly for now, until things get organized, until the economy sort of gets rehabilitated and revives again.
How do you plan to establish relations with Russia and Iran?
In terms of the relations with Russia and Iran, actually, it's like the relations with any of the other countries. Yes, they have been very supportive of the Assad regime over the last few years. I think with Iran, it might be a little harder for the Syrian people, mainly because some of the Iran-backed militias had, caused a lot of pain for Syrians in the way they supported the regime on their practices on the ground. There were some grave violations of human rights for a lot of Syrians and Syrian communities. But at the end of the day, Syria is going to be part of the international community, and Iran is a major country, and the Iranian people, we can't, they're just like the Syrian people. If they have a government that is not acceptable, they're also suffering. But at the end of the day, we're all living in this region, and we need to coexist in a peaceful manner. Of course, we think that it might take time, but at the end of the day, the relationships with the other countries should be based on mutual respect and cooperation and mutual interest, and not be serving anybody's interests. So I think in the future there should be normal relations, as long as everybody respects everybody's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And when I say we need to live peacefully with everybody, of course, that that doesn't include Israel. Not that we don't want peace with them, but at the end of the day, this is an occupation force, and they are, of course, we're seeing the atrocities they are committing in Gaza and all of Palestine, and what they did in Lebanon, and today they're encroaching on Syria. So that is one exception, another issue that needs to be dealt with in a different way.
And which countries do you want to collaborate with? And how will your relations with Turkey be shaped?
Of course, I think the most important is to go from the mentality that we need the closer you are to us, the more that we need to be friendly with each other, to have better relations. Historically, there have been a lot of times when there were good relationships between Syria and Turkey. Over the last 13 years, of course, the relations were not as good between Turkey and the Assad regime, and this was because of what the Assad regime did. But with the Syrian people, I think there are bases and foundations for a very good, prosperous relationship to be in the future going forward. And of course, we share with Turkey the longest borders of all of our neighbors. And I was saying earlier to someone that there are a lot of families and a lot of people on both sides of the borders that are either one family on the Syrian side and also on the Turkish side, but also these communities have been friendly communities for a long time. So I foresee very good relationships with Turkey, and I also foresee good relationships with the Arab countries. Again, because in the region, this entire region needs stability. We deserve it. The peoples of this region deserve it after all these years and decades of imperialism, colonialism, and wars. So I think we all need to work together, and this, our first step in that regard is to ensure stability of Syria, and we hope we can be a positive factor in achieving stability in the entire region.
President Erdoğan delivered a clear message to the global community, stating, "Syria belongs to Syrians. We will not Syria to be divided." What are your thoughts on this?
This actually, of course, we welcome these kinds of comments, and this is nothing new. I think the government of Turkey and from President Erdogan himself, these have been consistently the same over the last 13 years. Even the way the relationships developed with the Esad regime, because Turkey was one of the first countries to take a strong stance and made strong statements against what Esad was doing, and then later, as some groups tried to take advantage of the situation and work in a manner that pushes towards division of Syria, he has made the same comments. And this is very important for us because this aligns exactly with our vision for Syria.
How does President Erdogan's stance and the Syrian people's love for him resonate with you?
I think there is a lot of alignment between his stance and what the Syrian people want, and the Syrian people have been appreciative because Turkey was one of the first places, one of the first countries they sought shelter in when the Assad regime was started bombing more and more areas of Syria, and over the last few years they found a home here. But I think, you know, now we're going to say thank you to our host. But we can take, you know, a lot of these good relations that we've built with the Turkish people over the last few years to ensure that this continues and we move on to the future where we have good relationships between Syria and Turkey. And the comments by President Erdogan, a lot of them in terms of finding a peaceful solution in Syria, Syria becoming again a safe place for the refugees to go back to, and working against the division of Syria. These are all the same things that we want as Syrians.
Ms. Musa, thank you for joining us. It was a really great pleasure having you here.
Thank you for hosting me.